The screen that pierced through Flight 447's cabin at 40,000 feet wasn't one of turbulence or mechanical failure. It was the sound of absolute terror as Chen watched three men in business suits rise from their seats, weapons glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hands, still sticky from the burger grease she'd scrub it off just hours before her shift at the airport's food court, instinctively moved to her seatbelt. But something deeper than fear coursed through her veins, something that had been dormant for 8 long years. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Everyone stay calm, the lead hijacker shouted in accented English, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. This aircraft is now under our control. Maya's breathing slowed, her heartbeat finding a rhythm she hadn't felt since she was 22 years old. Sitting in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon over the Nevada desert. The other passengers around her dissolved into panic crying, shouting, praying, but Maya's world had suddenly become crystal clear. The emergency lighting cast shadows that reminded her of the pre-dawn briefings at Nellis Air Force Base, where she'd once been Lieutenant Chen, calcined Phoenix, one of the youngest pilots ever accepted into the Navy's elite Top Gun program. The elderly man beside her, Harold, clutched his wife's hand with shaking fingers. Maya had been chatting with them just minutes before about their anniversary trip to Paris, admiring the faded photographs Harold had shown her of his late military service. His Bronze Star medal caught the light as he trembled, and Maya felt something ignite in her chest, the same protective instinct that had driven her to excel in aerial combat training. "Please," Harold whispered to her, his roomy eyes wide with fear. "My Martha has a heart condition. She can't handle this stress." Maya placed her hand over his, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins of a man who had once served his country with honor. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, "I need you to trust me. Keep your wife calm, and when I give you a signal, a tap on your shoulder, I need you both to get as low as possible." The lead hijacker was moving down the aisle now, his two accomplices flanking him. Maya's tactical mind, rusty from years of flipping burgers and taking drive-through orders, began to assess the situation with military precision. 3 hostiles, likely armed with ceramic weapons that had passed through security. Approximately 180 passengers, mostly civilians with no combat training. The cockpit door was reinforced post-9/11, but these men seemed confident, suggesting they had a plan to breach it. What they didn't know, what nobody on this flight knew, was that the woman in seat 24C, who had served them chicken nuggets and asked if they wanted to make it a meal deal just 3 hours ago, had once been cleared to carry nuclear weapons. She had once performed aerial maneuvers at speeds that would liquefy an untrained pilot's brain. She had once been trusted with protecting American airspace from threats exactly like this. The memories flooded back unbidden. Her commander's voice. During her final evaluation, "Chen, you have the finest tactical mind I've seen in 20 years of service. Your situational awareness is unprecedented." Her wingman's radio chatter during their last mission together. "Phoenix, you just pulled off a maneuver that should be illegal in 3 states. The weight of the flight suit, the familiar hum of the jet engine, the absolute certainty that came with being perfectly trained for life and death situations, but that was before the incident. Before the court-martial that destroyed her career and her confidence. Before 8 years of trying to forget that she had ever been capable of extraordinary things. The lead hijacker stopped beside a businessman in first class, pressing his weapon against the man's temple. "I want everyone to understand," he announced to the cabin, "that cooperation ensures survival. Resistance ensures death." His eyes swept the cabin, and for a moment they lingered on Maya. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition? Suspicion? She forced herself to look away, to appear as terrified as everyone else. But inside, Phoenix was awakening. The aircraft shuddered slightly, and Maya realized they were beginning to change course. Through the small window, she could see the sun's position shifting. They were turning away from their intended destination. She estimated their altitude, their speed, and began calculating fuel consumption rates in her head, old habits returning like muscle memory. If these men intended to use the plane as a weapon, they would need to reach their target within the next 2 hours before fuel became critical. The flight attendant, Jessica, was being forced to make an announcement over the intercom. Her voice shook as she repeated the hijackers' demands for compliance. Maya had noticed Jessica during boarding, young, maybe 25, with kind eyes and a genuine smile when she'd helped an elderly passenger with his carry-on. Now those same eyes were filled with terror as one of the hijackers pressed his weapon to her back. Maya's hands moved unconsciously to her lap, forming the grip she'd once used on her flight controls. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, drawing on years of meditation and mental preparation that had been drilled into her during pilot training. The other passengers were hyperventilating, their panic feeding on itself. But Maya felt herself entering what her instructor had called the zone, that state of absolute clarity that separated elite pilots from everyone else. A child was crying somewhere behind her, and Maya's resolve hardened. She thought of all the families on this plane, all the dreams and hopes and futures that hung in the balance. She thought of Harold and Martha, celebrating 60 years of marriage with a trip they'd saved for their entire lives. She thought of Jessica, probably working this job to pay for college, with parents at home who would never recover if their daughter didn't come home. And she thought of herself, Maya Chen, who had spent 8 years believing she was broken, believing that one terrible mistake had stripped away everything that made her special. She had served burgers and fries to teenagers who looked at her like she was invisible, like she was just another minimum wage worker with no dreams, no skills, no value. She had convinced herself that she deserved nothing more than the anonymity of food service, that her military training was just an embarrassing chapter in a book she'd rather forget. But terrorists don't care about your past failures. They don't care about your shame or your self-doubt. They only care about power, about inflicting terror on innocent people. And as Maya watched the lead hijacker shove an elderly woman back into her seat with unnecessary force, she realized that some things were worth overcoming your demons for. The plane banked slightly to the left, and Maya's inner ear automatically adjusted to the change in orientation, another old reflex that had never truly faded. She estimated they were now heading southeast, possibly toward a major population center. The hijackers were speaking to each other in hushed tones, but Maya caught fragments of their conversation. Her Arabic was rudimentary, picked up during deployments overseas, but she understood enough to know they were discussing timing and approach vectors. They were planning something catastrophic, and Maya was the only person on this plane with the skills to stop them. She closed her eyes for just a moment, reaching back through 8 years of suppressed memories to find the woman she used to be. Lieutenant Maya Chen, who had never backed down from a challenge. Phoenix, whose calcine had been earned by rising from the ashes of every obstacle in her path. The pilot who had been told by her instructors that she was destined for greatness, that she had the rare combination of technical skill and tactical instinct that couldn't be taught. When she opened her eyes again, something fundamental had changed. The fear was still there. She wasn't superhuman, but underneath, it was a bedrock of certainty that she hadn't felt in 8 years. These men had made a critical error in targeting this flight. They had assumed that a plane full of civilians would be helpless, that fear and chaos would be their allies. They had no idea that the woman in 24C had once been cleared to protect the nation's most sensitive assets. They had no idea that her reflexes had been honed by thousands of hours of combat simulation. They had no idea that her mind had been trained to remain calm and analytical in situations that would break most people. But they were about to find out. Maya began her assessment with surgical precision. The lead hijacker tall, approximately 180 pounds, favoring his left leg slightly, suggesting an old injury. His weapon appeared to be a ceramic knife, sharp enough to be lethal, but brittle enough to break under the right kind of stress. He moved with confidence, but not with the fluid grace of someone with extensive combat training. Dangerous, but not invincible. The second man, shorter and stockier, seemed nervous. He kept checking his watch and glancing toward the cockpit, suggesting he was responsible for timing their operation. His weapon was similar, but he held it awkwardly, like someone who had trained with it, but wasn't comfortable with violence. A potential weak link. The third man was the wild card. He moved like a soldier, controlled, aware of his surroundings, constantly scanning for threats. His weapon discipline was better, and Maya noticed the way he positioned himself to maintain sight lines on both his colleagues and the cabin. He would be the most dangerous in a direct confrontation, but his tactical awareness also made him predictable. The cabin layout was burned into her memory now, every exit, every potential weapon, every obstacle and advantage. The galley behind her contained metal serving trays that could be used as shields or improvised weapons. The overhead bins contained luggage that could provide cover or distraction. The narrow aisle limited movement, but also created choke points that could be exploited. But most importantly, Maya realized that she had something these men didn't expect and couldn't plan for: the element of complete surprise. For 8 years, she had been invisible, unremarkable, just another face in the crowd. Nobody looked at a fast food worker and saw a weapon. Nobody expected a minimum wage employee to possess the skills of an elite military pilot. Harold squeezed her arm gently. "Miss, are you all right? You seem different." Maya turned to him and smiled, and Harold later swore that something in her eyes reminded him of the young soldiers he'd served with in Korea. That look of absolute determination that came over people who had made peace with risking everything for what was right. "Sir," Maya whispered, "I want you to know that you and your wife are going to get to Paris. You're going to see the Eiffel Tower and eat croissants and celebrate your anniversary properly. I promise you that." "How can you possibly know that?" Harold asked. Maya's smile widened slightly. "Because 8 years ago, I used to hunt people like them for a living." Maya Chun's alarm clock had screamed at 4:30 a.m. every morning for 8 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not because she enjoyed early mornings, but because the opening shift at Murphy's fast food paid an extra 50 cents an hour. And 50 cents multiplied by 40 hours a week meant $20 that could go toward her mother's medical bills. She had calculated this equation so many times it had become a mantra, a mathematical prayer that kept her moving through the motions of a life that felt like someone else's. The apartment she shared with her aging mother in the shadow of Lax was small enough that Maya could hear every wheeze, every labored breath that reminded her why she couldn't afford to chase dreams anymore. The walls were thin, painted that particular shade of beige that landlords used because it showed dirt just slowly enough to avoid immediate complaints. The carpet was industrial gray, chosen for its ability to hide stains rather than provide comfort. This was what practical looked like when dreams died hard. Maya's morning routine was military precise, a holdover from her Air Force days that she couldn't shake despite 8 years of trying. Shower, 4 minutes, 45 seconds. Dress, 2 minutes. Coffee, instant, because the good stuff was a luxury she'd trained herself not to want. Check on Mom, 30 seconds to ensure she was breathing, sleeping peacefully, that the medications were working their quiet magic against the cancer that was winning their war of attrition. The drive to work took her past the airfield where private jets and commercial flights traced lazy patterns across the California sky. Every morning, Maya would catch herself tracking their trajectories, calculating approach angles and wind corrections with the automatic precision of someone whose mind had been trained to think in 3 dimensions. Every morning, she would force herself to look away, to focus on the traffic and the radio and anything else that didn't remind her of who she used to be. But today was different. Today, Maya had been scheduled for a double shift her usual morning slot at Murphy's, followed by an afternoon shift at the airport food court. The airport job was newer, something she'd taken on 6 months ago when her mother's oncologist had mentioned a promising new treatment that their insurance wouldn't cover. Experimental therapies cost experimental money, and Maya had long since made peace with sacrificing her comfort for her mother's chance at a few more years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was working at the same airport she'd once called home during her military career. Lax had been a refueling stop during training missions, a place where she'd once walked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. Now she navigated its corridors in a polyester uniform, asking travelers if they wanted to add apple pie to their order. "Maya, you're on Register 3 today," called Janet, the food court supervisor, a woman whose entire personality seemed built around the authority her clipboard provided. "And remember, we're pushing the new spicy chicken sandwich. Corporate wants to see those numbers up." Maya nodded, tying her apron with practiced efficiency. The food court was already buzzing with early morning travelers, business people grabbing coffee before red-eye flights, families corralling children and luggage with equal determination, couples saying goodbye with the kind of desperate intensity that suggested long separations ahead. Maya had become an expert at reading these small human dramas, filing them away as she worked. The morning rush was relentless. Order after order blurred together: a double cheeseburger, no pickles; chicken nuggets, extra sauce; fish sandwich, hold the tartar sauce because of allergies. Maya's hands moved automatically, her mind free to wander in ways that both comforted and tormented her. She found herself calculating fuel weights and wind speeds while asking customers if they wanted to make their meal a combo. She estimated altitude and air density while explaining that yes, they were out of the chocolate chip cookies, but the oatmeal raisin were fresh. During her break, Maya retreated to the small employee area behind the kitchen, a windowless space that smelled of industrial cleaner and reheated food. She sat on a folding chair that had seen better decades and pulled out her phone, scrolling through the same 3 websites she checked every day. Job listings for aircraft mechanics, all requiring certifications she couldn't afford. Updates from her mother's medical team, cautiously optimistic, which was doctor speak for "we're trying everything," and a forum for former military pilots that she read but never posted in. The pilot forum was a special kind of torture. Her former colleagues shared stories of their current lives. Some had transitioned to commercial aviation, others to aerospace engineering, a few to civilian flight instruction. They posted pictures from exotic destinations, spoke casually about aircraft they were flying, used technical jargon that made Maya's chest tight with longing. She was a ghost haunting her own past, invisible among people who had once been her peers. "You could get back into it, you know," her mother had said just last week. During one of their rare conversations about Maya's career, Chen was 72, silver-haired, and stubborn in the way that only mothers can be when they're watching their children suffer. "That thing that happened, it wasn't your fault. Everyone said so." But Maya had stopped trying to explain that official findings didn't erase the weight of responsibility. That being cleared of wrongdoing didn't undo the images that still haunted her dreams. That sometimes the hardest person to forgive was yourself. The incident had been what military investigators called a systems failure, cascade, a series of mechanical problems that had resulted in the loss of a training aircraft and very nearly the loss of Maya's life. She had ejected safely, landing in the Nevada desert with nothing more than bruises and a concussion. The investigation had found no pilot error, no violations of protocol, no reason to hold Lieutenant Chen responsible for what was ultimately determined to be a manufacturing defect in the aircraft's hydraulic system. But Maya had been in the cockpit when the warning lights started flashing. She had felt the controls go sluggish, heard the engines begin to whine in ways that spoke of imminent failure. And in that moment, a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds but felt like hours, she had frozen, not physically. Her training had taken over, and she had executed the emergency procedures flawlessly. But mentally, emotionally, she had experienced a crisis of confidence so profound that it shook the very foundation of who she thought she was. Elite pilots weren't supposed to feel fear. They weren't supposed to doubt themselves or question their abilities in life or death situations. They were supposed to be unshakable, invincible, superhuman. And in those 3 seconds of system failure, Maya had felt utterly, completely human. The review board had been kind. Her commanding officer had been supportive. Her fellow pilots had rallied around her, insisting that what she'd experienced was normal, understandable, nothing to be ashamed of. But Maya had submitted her resignation 2 weeks later, unable to reconcile the image she had of herself as an elite warrior with the reality of her very human response to mortal danger. "Chen," Janet's voice cut through Maya's thoughts. "Break's over. We've got a line out front." Maya pocketed her phone and returned to her station, muscle memory taking over as she fell back into the rhythm of service. But something was different. Today, the customers seemed more tense, more hurried. Airport security was more visible than usual, and Maya noticed several passengers being pulled aside for additional screening. The overhead announcements came more frequently, requests for passenger cooperation, reminders about security protocols, the usual post-9/11's vigilance that had become background noise in American airports. Around noon, Maya's supervisor approached, with a clipboard and the kind of expression that usually preceded bad news. "Chen, I need you to cover for Rodriguez on the afternoon shift. He called in sick, and we're already short-staffed." Maya's heart sank. She had been looking forward to going home, to checking on her mother, to maybe having a few hours to herself. For the first time in weeks. But overtime was overtime, and overtime was medication money. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "Which gate?" "Food court near Terminal C. You'll be working the mobile cart sandwiches and snacks for passengers. Boarding flights, easy money." Maya nodded, though nothing about her life had been easy for 8 years. She gathered her things and made her way to Terminal C, navigating the familiar maze of shops and restaurants and departure gates. The mobile food cart was exactly what it sounded like, a wheeled kiosk stocked with pre-packaged sandwiches, snacks, and beverages that she would push from gate to gate, targeting passengers with long layovers or delayed flights. The work was mind-numbing in its simplicity, but Maya had learned to find zen in repetition. She moved through the terminal with quiet efficiency, offering food to travelers who barely looked at her face, processing transactions with the kind of invisible competence that service workers develop as armor against the world's indifference. It was while serving passengers at Gate 23 that Maya first noticed them. 3 men in business suits, expensive looking, the kind of travelers who usually flew first class and treated airport employees like furniture. But something about their behavior caught her attention, the way they kept checking their phones, the frequency with which they scanned their surroundings, the fact that despite appearing to travel together, they maintained careful distance from one another. Maya had been trained to notice patterns, to identify behavior that deviated from the norm. 8 years of fast food hadn't dulled those instincts. If anything, watching people all day had sharpened her ability to read subtle cues. These men were nervous about something, and their nervousness didn't match the typical anxiety of air travel. She approached their gate area with her cart, calling out the usual script: fresh sandwiches, snacks, and beverages. Perfect for long flights. One of the men, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of beard that suggested careful grooming, purchased a bottle of water and a bag of chips. His accent was slight but noticeable, possibly Middle Eastern. When he handed her the money, Maya noticed that his hands were soft, uncalloused, not the hands of someone who worked with his hands for a living. But there were small scars on his knuckles, the kind that came from combat training or martial arts. The second man, shorter, stockier, with nervous eyes, bought a sandwich but didn't seem interested in eating it. He kept glancing toward the boarding area, checking his watch with the frequency of someone operating on a very precise timeline. When Maya handed him his change, she noticed he was sweating despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. The third man didn't buy anything, but Maya felt his eyes on her as she served the other passengers. When she finally looked in his direction, he was pretending to read a newspaper, but his posture was wrong, too rigid, too alert. He was watching everyone, cataloging faces and movements with the kind of systematic observation that Maya recognized from her own military training. None of this would have been cause for alarm on its own. Nervous travelers were common, and Maya had learned not to judge people based on appearance or ethnicity. But something about the combination of their behavior, their careful spacing, and their obvious tension set off alarm bells that had been silent for 8 years. Maya finished her rounds at gate 23 and moved to the next boarding area. But her mind kept returning to the 3 men. She found herself calculating their position relative to the security checkpoints, noting which flight they seemed to be waiting for, observing their interactions with other passengers. Old habits were reasserting themselves, and Maya realized with surprise that she was conducting what her Air Force instructors would have called threat assessment. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. For 8 years, Maya had worked to suppress the part of herself that thought in terms of tactics and strategy. She had convinced herself that those skills were irrelevant to her new life, that the woman who could outfly enemy fighters and navigate complex combat scenarios had no place behind a fast food counter. But watching those 3 men, feeling her old instincts come alive, Maya realized that some parts of yourself could be buried, but never truly killed. As she prepared to move to the next gate, Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How's work, honey? Don't forget to eat something. Yourself." The message was typical of Eleanor Chen, concerned about everyone else's well-being, even while fighting her own battles with cancer and chemotherapy. Maya smiled despite her growing unease, typing back a quick response about everything being fine, just busy, but everything wasn't fine. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the 3 men represented a threat she couldn't quite define. She found herself planning routes through the terminal that would allow her to keep them in sight, making mental notes about security personnel and emergency protocols. For the first time in 8 years, Lieutenant Maya Chen Calcine Phoenix was stirring the life. And somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of self-doubt and suppressed dreams, Maya realized that she had missed this feeling. The sharp focus, the tactical awareness, the sense that her mind was operating at full capacity for something that mattered. She had forgotten what it felt like to be truly awake, truly alive, truly herself. The boarding announcement for Flight 447 to Paris echoed through the terminal, and Maya watched as the 3 men moved toward the gate with practiced casualness. Her heart began to beat faster, and for a moment she considered alerting security. But alert them to what? 3 men buying plane tickets? Nervous travelers acting nervous? Instead, Maya made a decision that would change everything. As the final boarding call was announced, she approached the gate agent with her cart and struck up a conversation about shift changes and employee breaks. What she was really doing was watching, memorizing faces and seat assignments, noting which passengers seemed to know the 3 men and which ones appeared to be traveling alone. By the time Flight 447's doors closed, Maya had compiled a mental dossier on every passenger in the boarding area. She had noted the elderly couple celebrating their anniversary, the young businesswoman traveling for work, the college student heading home to study abroad. She had cataloged potential allies and likely casualties, estimated physical capabilities and psychological resilience, Planned contingencies for scenarios she prayed would never unfold. For 8 years, Chen had been just another invisible service worker, forgotten and overlooked by a world that had moved on without her. But as Flight 447 taxied toward the runway, something fundamental had shifted. Phoenix was awakening, and Maya realized that some transformations couldn't be stopped, only embraced. She didn't know yet that she would be on that plane. Didn't know that a last-minute scheduling change would put her in seat 24C, surrounded by the same passengers she had been unconsciously protecting from behind her food cart. Didn't know that the 3 men whose behavior had troubled her were about to turn a routine flight into a battle for survival. But she was ready. For the first time in 8 years, Chen was exactly where she needed to be, with exactly the skills the situation would demand. She just didn't know it yet. The boarding call for Flight 447 came over Maya's radio, just as she was finishing her shift at the airport food court. "Chen, we need you on standby duty. Rodriguez is definitely out sick, and we've got passenger service requests on the outbound flights." Maya's stomach dropped. Standby duty meant she could be assigned to any flight that needed additional cabin service, everything from helping with passenger meals to assisting with medical emergencies. It was overtime pay, which her mother's medical bills desperately needed. But it also meant another 8 hours away from home. Which flights? Maya asked, already knowing she would accept regardless of the answer. Flight 447 to Paris. They're requesting additional service staff for the meal service. Premium passengers, long flight, you know the drill. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the airport's air conditioning. Flight 447. The same flight she'd watched the 3 suspicious men board just 2 hours earlier. The coincidence felt less like chance and more like destiny, though. Maya had learned to distrust feelings that couldn't be quantified or analyzed. 30 minutes later, Maya found herself in the cramped employee area of Flight 447, changing into the burgundy uniform of in-flight service staff. The flight attendants briefed her quickly on meal service procedures, emergency protocols, and passenger manifest details. The plane was nearly full, 178 passengers plus crew, bound for Charles de Gaulle Airport with a flight time of just over 11 hours. "You'll be working coach," explained Jessica, the lead flight attendant Maya had noticed earlier. "Rows 20 through 35. It's mostly families and business travelers, pretty routine crowd. The only thing unusual is we've got a few last-minute seat changes in first class, but that's not your section." Maya nodded, but her attention was focused on the passenger manifest she'd glimpsed over Jessica's shoulder. The 3 men she'd observed were seated in different sections of the plane: business class, premium economy, and coach. Not together, but positioned to have sight lines through the entire aircraft. The arrangement looked random to untrained eyes, but Maya recognized it immediately as a tactical deployment. As passengers finished boarding and the plane prepared for departure, Maya moved through her assigned section, checking seatbelts and overhead bins with practiced efficiency. But her real focus was on cataloging every face, every voice, every detail that might prove relevant if her suspicions proved correct. The elderly couple from the gate, Harold and Martha, were in seats 24B and 24A. Maya's assigned jump seat for takeoff was 24C, directly beside them. "Such a lovely young woman," Martha said as Maya helped her adjust her seatbelt. "Are you excited about visiting Paris?" "I'm working the flight, ma'am," Maya replied with a smile. "But I hope you and your husband have a wonderful anniversary trip." Harold studied Maya with the sharp eyes of someone who had served in the military. "You carry yourself like someone with training. This Army, Navy, Air Force," Maya said before she could stop herself. "But that was a long time ago." "Once Air Force, always Air Force," Harold said with a knowing grin. "My grandson is stationed at Lackland. What was your specialty?" Maya hesitated, old security clearances and classified mission details, making her cautious about revealing too much. "Pilot," she said finally. "Fighter pilot." Harold's eyebrows rose. "Top Gun? Something like that." Maya forced a smile and moved on to the next row, but she could feel Harold's thoughtful gaze following her dot. The takeoff was routine, a smooth ascent into the clear California sky, with the familiar sensation of acceleration that brought back vivid memories of afterburner ignitions and carrier landings. Maya found herself automatically calculating airspeed and altitude, her inner ear adjusting to the aircraft's attitude changes with the unconscious precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours in the air. But as Flight 447 reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign went dark, Maya's attention focused on the three men who had triggered her suspicions. The tall one, she had mentally designated him Target 1, was seated in business class, directly behind the bulkhead that separated premium passengers from coach. From his position, he could observe both the cockpit area and the main cabin, while remaining relatively isolated from other passengers. Target 2, the shorter, nervous man, was in premium economy, positioned near the emergency exits. His placement gave him control over two of the aircraft's primary evacuation routes, and Maya noted that he kept checking his watch with obsessive regularity. Every few minutes he would glance toward the front of the plane, as if waiting for some predetermined signal. Target 3 was the most concerning. Seated in coach, he had selected an aisle seat that provided sightlines through the entire main cabin. But more troubling was his behavior. He had declined meal service, avoided eye contact with flight attendants, and spent the first hour of the flight systematically observing other passengers with the kind of tactical awareness that Maya recognized from her own military training. 2 hours into the flight, Maya was serving beverages in her section when she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. Target 3 was speaking quietly to the passenger beside him, a middle-aged businessman who seemed oblivious to any danger. "Excuse me," Target 3 was saying, his accent more pronounced now that he wasn't trying to hide it. "Would you mind switching seats with me? I have a friend in first class I'd like to be closer to." The businessman looked confused. "But your seat is better than mine." "I'm in a middle seat." "I insist," Target 3 said, and there was something in his tone that made the businessman's expression change. "Please." Maya watched the exchange with growing alarm. Moving passengers around the cabin wasn't unusual, but Target 3's motivation seemed tactical rather than social. The seat he was requesting would put him even closer to the cockpit, with better access to the galley area where the aircraft's emergency equipment was stored. She continued serving beverages, but her mind was racing through threat assessments and response scenarios. If these men were planning some kind of coordinated action, they had positioned themselves perfectly to control the aircraft's key areas. The timing of their behavior suggested they were waiting for a specific moment, perhaps when the crew was distracted by meal service, or when most passengers would be asleep. Maya's training kicked in, and she began formulating contingency plans. The aircraft's emergency equipment included fire extinguishers that could be weaponized, oxygen masks that could provide breathing apparatus, and defibrillator units that contained batteries capable of generating significant electrical discharge. The galley areas contained knives and other potential weapons, though post-9/11 security measures had eliminated most obvious threats. But Maya's greatest advantage wasn't equipment, it was knowledge. She understood aircraft systems, flight dynamics, and emergency procedures in ways that most hijackers wouldn't anticipate. She knew how to depressurize the cabin in controlled stages, how to manipulate lighting and communication systems, how to use the aircraft itself as a weapon against anyone who threatened its passengers. The meal service began 90 minutes later, and Maya noticed that all three suspects declined food with polite but firm refusal. They also avoided alcohol, staying alert while encouraging other passengers to relax and lower their guard. Target 1 engaged a businessman in friendly conversation about international markets. Target 2 helped an elderly woman with her carry-on bag. Target 3 complimented a flight attendant on her service. They were charming, friendly, utterly unremarkable except to someone trained to recognize. Predatory behavior disguised as social interaction. Maya was collecting meal trays in business class when she witnessed the first overt sign of coordination between the suspects. Target 1 checked his watch, then made eye contact with Target 2 across the cabin. The exchange lasted less than a second, but Maya caught it a subtle nod, barely perceptible, but unmistakably a signal. Her heart rate spiked, and Maya felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once preceded combat missions. Every instinct screamed that whatever these men were planning was about to begin. She glanced toward the cockpit, noting the positions of the flight crew, calculating response times and communication protocols. The next few minutes felt like hours. Maya continued her service duties while conducting what her Air Force training called environmental preparation, identifying potential weapons, noting passenger positions, planning movement routes through the cabin. Harold caught her eye from his seat and seemed to sense her tension. His own military experience was clearly picking up on her heightened alertness. At 9:47 p.m. Pacific Time, Maya would remember the exact moment forever. Target 1 rose from his seat and walked toward the front lavatory. Target 2 followed 30 seconds later, heading toward the rear facilities. Target 3 remained seated, but Maya noticed his hand moving inside his jacket. This was it. Maya moved quickly toward her service area, grabbing a coffee pot that could serve as both weapon and distraction. Her military training had taught her that the key to survival in ambush situations was speed, surprise, and overwhelming aggression. Don't wait for the enemy to act. Identify the threat and neutralize it before it could fully develop. But she was no longer Lieutenant Maya Chen of the United States Air Force. She was an airport food service worker with no authority, no backup, and no official standing to take action against passengers who hadn't actually committed any crime yet. Moving against them prematurely could result in criminal charges against her, lawsuits, and the destruction of what little life she had managed to build. The moral calculus was agonizing. Act too soon, and she could be wrong, destroying innocent lives and facing legal consequences that would devastate her and her mother. Act too late, and everyone on Flight 447 could die. Maya made her choice. She approached Harold's seat with deliberate casualness, leaning down as if to collect his empty beverage cup. "Sir," she whispered urgently, "I need you to listen carefully and not react. The 3 men I told you about earlier, they're about to make their move. In 30 seconds, I need you and your wife to get on the floor and stay down no matter what happens." Harold's military instincts kicked in immediately. His expression remained neutral, but Maya saw the subtle shift. In his posture, the slight straightening of shoulders, the unconscious checking of exits. "What do you need from me?" he whispered back. "Just protect your wife and follow my lead." And Harold, Maya paused, meeting his eyes with the intensity of someone about to cross a line from which there was no return. "What I'm about to do is going to look crazy, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." Before Harold could respond, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, the automatic adjustment for nighttime cruising that would provide cover for what Maya suspected was about to unfold. Target 1 emerged from the forward lavatory, but instead of returning to his seat, he moved toward the galley area. Target 2 was walking back from the rear of the plane, but his path was taking him toward the center of the cabin rather than his assigned seat. Target 3 stood up, and Maya saw the flash of ceramic as he pulled a weapon from inside his jacket. "Everyone stay calm," Target 3 announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This aircraft is now under our control." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, children cried, and the collective panic threatened to spiral beyond anyone's ability to manage. But Maya felt a strange calm descend over her, the same clarity she had experienced in the cockpit during emergency situations, when training and instinct merged into something greater than conscious thought. Target 1 had moved to block access to the cockpit, positioning himself between the flight deck and any potential rescue attempt. Target 2 was herding passengers away from the emergency exits, using their own panic against them to maintain control. And Target 3 was advancing down the aisle with his weapon visible, terrorizing the cabin into submission, what they hadn't counted on was the woman in the burgundy service uniform, who was no longer thinking like an airport food worker. Maya moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body remembered combat training even when her mind had tried to forget. She grabbed the heavy coffee pot from her service cart and hurled it at Target 2, not to injure him but to distract him and create an opening. The scalding liquid caught him across the face and chest, and his howl of pain and surprise gave Maya the seconds she needed to close the distance. Target 2 was fumbling for his weapon, temporarily blinded by coffee and pain, when Maya struck. Her first blow was to his solar plexus, a precise hit that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. Her second was to the back of his neck, a nerve strike that rendered him unconscious before he hit the cabin floor. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds. Target 1 spun around at the commotion, abandoning his position near the cockpit to assist his colleague. This was the mistake Maya had been hoping for. In tactical situations, emotional responses often overrode strategic thinking. His movement toward her created the opening she needed to reach the galley's emergency equipment. "Jessica!" Maya shouted to the lead flight attendant, who was frozen in terror near the front of the cabin. "Get to the cockpit and tell them we have a situation. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone." Jessica hesitated for a crucial moment, looking between Maya and the advancing hijacker with the paralysis of someone thrust into a situation beyond her training. Maya didn't have time for gentleness. "Move," she commanded, using the voice that had once directed fighter pilots in combat situations. "Now!" Jessica ran. Target 1 was charging toward Maya now, his ceramic weapon gleaming in the cabin lights. But Maya had reached the galley, and her hands found the emergency fire extinguisher mounted behind the service counter. She yanked it free and triggered the discharge mechanism just as Target 1 reached her. The blast of chemical suppressant caught him full in the face, the pressurized foam blinding him and filling his lungs with an irritant that sent him into violent coughing spasms. Maya followed the chemical attack with the extinguisher itself, swinging the heavy metal cylinder in a wide arc that connected with Target 1's temple and dropped him like a stone. 2 down. Target 3 was advancing from the rear of the cabin, but the narrow aisle worked to Maya's advantage. He couldn't maneuver effectively, and the panicking passengers provided both cover and obstacles that slowed his approach. Maya could see the calculation in his eyes. He was realizing that this wasn't going according to plan, that the flight attendant who had just neutralized 2 of his companions was not a typical airline employee. "Who are you?" he demanded, his weapon extended but his confidence clearly shaken. "What organization are you with?" Maya stepped over Target 1's unconscious form and began walking toward Target 3, her movements deliberate and controlled. The passengers around her seemed to sense the shift. In dynamic, several had stopped screaming and were watching the confrontation with the fascination of people witnessing something extraordinary. 8 years ago, Maya said, her voice carrying through the cabin with surprising calm, "I was Lieutenant Maya Chen, United States Air Force, Calcine Phoenix. I was cleared to carry nuclear weapons and trained to neutralize threats to American airspace." Target 3's eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible. You're a food service worker." Maya smiled, and several passengers later said it was the most terrifying expression they had ever seen. "For 8 years, I've been serving burgers and asking if people want to make it a meal deal. But before that, I spent 6 years hunting people exactly like you." She was close enough now that Target 3 had to make a choice: retreat or attack. His tactical training told him to fall back and reassess, but his pride and desperation demanded a frontal assault. He chose poorly. Target 3 lunged forward with his ceramic blade, aiming for Maya's center mass in a move that would have been effective against an untrained opponent. But Maya sidestepped with the fluid grace of someone who had practiced close-quarters combat for thousands of hours, grabbing his wrist and using his own momentum to drive him into the galley wall. The ceramic weapon shattered against the metal surface, and Target 3 found himself in a grappling match with someone whose strength had been forged in military training and maintained through years of physical labor. Maya's grip on his wrist was unbreakable, her leverage perfect, her technique flawless. "You made one critical mistake," Maya said as she applied pressure to nerve points that sent waves of agony through Target 3's arm. "You assumed that because I was serving food, I was harmless." Target 3 tried to knee her in the ribs, but Maya twisted away and used his imbalance to throw him to the cabin floor. He landed hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping like a landed fish. Maya knelt beside him, one knee on his chest, her hand positioned at his throat in a way that promised unconsciousness or worse if he continued to struggle. "Here's what's going to happen," she said quietly. "You're going to tell me how many others are involved in this operation. You're going to tell me what your target was. And you're going to tell me if there are any explosive devices on this aircraft." "Go to hell," Target 3 gasped. Maya's pressure on his throat increased slightly. "I've been to hell. I've been serving fast food for 8 years because I lost my confidence in a situation exactly like this. But you know what? Facing real terrorists makes dealing with difficult customers seem like a vacation." Around them, the cabin had fallen into stunned silence. Passengers were beginning to realize that the nightmare was over, that the unassuming service worker had somehow neutralized 3 armed hijackers with the efficiency of a seasoned combat veteran. Harold was helping his wife to her feet, his eyes bright with military pride. Jessica had emerged from the cockpit with news that the pilots were diverting to the nearest airport. But Maya's attention was focused entirely on the man beneath her knee. His eyes held the wild desperation of someone whose carefully planned operation had been destroyed by a factor no one could have predicted. He was weighing his options: surrender, suicide, or one last desperate gambit. "There are no others," he finally whispered. "No bombs, just ... just the 3 of us." Maya studied his face with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception. After a long moment, she nodded. "Good, because if you're lying to me, if there's any part of this plan you haven't told me about, I will find out. And I will be significantly less gentle than I've been so far." She stood up, leaving Target 3 gasping on the cabin floor, and surveyed the scene around her. 2 unconscious hijackers, 1 thoroughly defeated, and 178 passengers who were slowly beginning to understand that they were safe. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 6 minutes, but Maya felt like she had traveled back through 8 years of doubt and self-recrimination to rediscover who she really was. Harold approached her, his military bearing evident in every step. "Ma'am," he said formally, "on behalf of everyone on this aircraft, thank you. That was the finest display of tactical combat I've seen since Korea." Maya looked around the cabin at the faces staring back at her gratitude. Awe, respect, and something she hadn't seen directed at her in 8 years: recognition of her true capabilities. These people weren't seeing a fast food worker who had gotten lucky. They were seeing exactly what she had always been underneath the uniform and the self-doubt. They were seeing Phoenix. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Rodriguez emerged with the kind of expression worn by someone who had just experienced a minor miracle. "Ms. Chen," he said, "Air Traffic Control is asking for a full report. They're also asking if we need medical assistance or additional security when we land." Maya shook her head. The threat has been neutralized, Captain. These three are the only hostiles aboard. I've secured their weapons, and they're no longer capable of threatening anyone. Captain Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. Ma'am, I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened. Who exactly are you? Maya straightened her shoulders, and for the first time in 8 years, she answered that question with complete honesty. Captain, I'm Lieutenant Maya Chen, United States Air Force, Calcine Phoenix. And I'm exactly where I need to be. As Flight 447 continued its journey toward an emergency landing, Maya realized that the woman who had spent 8 years hiding behind a food service counter was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had remembered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting in spite of fear to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Phoenix had risen from the ashes of doubt and self-recrimination, and she was never going back down. The emergency landing at Denver International Airport was unlike anything in Maya's 8 years of civilian life, but hauntingly familiar to her military experience. As Flight 447 descended through layers of cloud cover, she found herself automatically calculating approach vectors and wind corrections, her pilot's mind reasserting itself with startling clarity. The passengers around her clutched armrests and whispered prayers, but Maya felt only the calm focus that came with being exactly where she belonged. FBI agents were waiting on the tarmac before the plane even came to a complete stop. Maya watched through the small window as black SUVs surrounded the aircraft, their positioning textbook perfect for a high-priority threat containment. She recognized the formation from her own training in counter-terrorism operations, and for a moment she wondered what it would feel like to be on the other side of such an operation. Miss Chen, Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. Federal agents are requesting that you remain seated until they can board and conduct their initial assessment. They want to speak with you first. Maya nodded to herself, understanding the protocol. She was simultaneously the hero who had saved the flight and an unknown quantity who had displayed military-grade combat skills in a civilian setting. Until the authorities could verify her story and assess her motivations, she would be treated as both asset and potential threat. The three hijackers were still unconscious or semi-conscious, zip tied with plastic restraints that Jessica had found in the aircraft security kit. Maya had checked their pulse and breathing every few minutes during the descent, ensuring they would survive to face questioning. As much as she despised what they had attempted, her military training emphasized the intelligence value of live captures. Harold squeezed her shoulder as the plane came to a final stop. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, you did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Martha nodded emphatically, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. You saved our lives, dear. You saved all of our lives. The boarding door opened, and 6 FBI agents entered the aircraft with the controlled urgency of professionals responding to a terrorist incident. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady gaze that suggested extensive field experience. She surveyed the cabin quickly, taking in the unconscious hijackers and the remarkably calm passengers. I'm Special Agent Sarah Morrison, she announced to the cabin. We need everyone to remain seated while we secure the scene and conduct preliminary interviews. This process will take some time, but we want to ensure everyone's safety and gather accurate information about what occurred. Her eyes found Maya and held them. Miss Chen, I presume? Maya stood, her movements careful and non-threatening. Yes, ma'am. Agent Morrison approached with 3 of her colleagues, their positioning designed to provide backup without appearing confrontational. Miss Chen, we've received some remarkable reports about your actions during this incident. We'd like to speak with you privately to get your account of events. Of course, Maya replied. But first, I want to make sure you understand that these passengers have been through a traumatic experience. They're scared, confused, and they've been incredibly brave. Whatever questions you have for them, please remember that. Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly. Understood. And Miss Chen, thank you. Initial reports suggest that your intervention prevented what could have been a catastrophic situation. Maya was escorted to the first-class cabin, which had been cleared of passengers and converted into a temporary interview area. The remaining FBI agents began processing the hijackers and conducting witness interviews with the efficiency that impressed even Maya's military-trained eyes. Before we begin, Agent Morrison said, settling into the seat across from Maya, I want you to know that we've already run a preliminary background check. Lieutenant Maya Chen, United States Air Force, honorably discharged 8 years ago after an exemplary service record. Top Gun graduate, multiple commendations, security clearance for nuclear weapon systems. Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The court-martial was dismissed with no findings of misconduct. Agent Morrison interrupted. The aircraft malfunction that ended your military career was determined to be the result of manufacturing defects, not pilot error. Your response to the emergency was textbook perfect. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. For 8 years, she had carried the weight of that day, the crushing certainty that she had somehow failed in her duties as a pilot. Hearing an FBI agent matter-of-factly state what the official investigation had concluded felt like emerging from underwater after holding her breath for nearly a decade. Why does that matter now? Maya asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Agent Morrison leaned forward slightly. Because what you did today, neutralizing 3 armed terrorists in a confined space with minimal collateral damage, required skills that very few people possess. We're trying to understand how a food service worker happened to have elite military combat training. Maya took a deep breath, realizing that this conversation would force her to confront truths she had been avoiding for 8 years. Agent Morrison, I've spent 8 years convinced that I was broken, that the incident that ended my military career proved I wasn't capable of the things I'd been trained to do. I took jobs in food service because I believed that was all I was good for anymore. And today I remembered who I was before I convinced myself I was someone else. Agent Morrison made notes on her tablet, but her attention remained focused on Maya's face. Walk me through your decision-making process during the hijacking. At what point did you realize what was happening? Maya organized her thoughts, drawing on the after-action report protocols she'd learned in the military. I first noticed the suspects approximately 4 hours before the incident while working at the airport food court. Their behavior patterns were inconsistent with typical air travelers. Too much surveillance, too much coordination, too much tension. But you didn't report your suspicions. Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. 8 years of civilian life had made me doubt my instincts. I thought I was seeing threats that weren't there. But you ended up on their flight. A coincidence. I was assigned to standby duty and placed on Flight 447 for additional meal service support. When I realized I was on the same plane as the suspects, I began conducting informal threat assessment. Agent Morrison's stylus paused over her tablet. Informal threat assessment. Observing their positions, noting their coordination signals, identifying potential weapons and defensive positions. Old habits from my military training. When did you decide to act? Maya closed her eyes, remembering those crucial moments when everything hung in the balance. When the third suspect stood up and drew his weapon. At that point, the threat was confirmed and immediate action was required to prevent casualties. You had no backup, no official authority, no communication with law enforcement. You acted entirely on your own initiative. Yes, ma'am. Agent Morrison set down her tablet and studied Maya with the intensity of someone reaching a significant conclusion. Ms. Chen, in my 15 years with the FBI, I've investigated dozens of terrorist incidents and attempted attacks. What you accomplished today single-handedly neutralizing a coordinated terrorist cell with no advance warning and no support is unprecedented. Maya shifted uncomfortably. I just did what needed to be done. No, Agent Morrison said firmly. You did what very few people in the world are capable of doing, and you did it perfectly. The interview continued for another hour, covering every detail of the incident from Maya's initial observations to the final restraint of the terrorists. Agent Morrison's questions were thorough but respectful, and Maya found herself describing tactical decisions and combat techniques she hadn't discussed in 8 years. When they finished, Agent Morrison walked Maya back to the main cabin where the passengers were being released after their own interviews. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically where there had been panic and terror. There was now a sense of shared experience and mutual support. Several passengers approached Maya as she passed, offering thanks and expressing admiration for her actions. Harold and Martha were among the last to be interviewed, and Harold sought out Maya before leaving the aircraft. Miss Chen, he said formally, I want you to know that what I witnessed today reminded me why I was proud to serve my country. You honored your uniform and your training in the finest tradition of military service. Martha hugged Maya with the fierce affection of someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. Dear, she said, promise me you won't go back to hiding who you are. The world needs people like you. As the passengers finally disembarked, Maya found herself alone in the cabin with Agent Morrison and the cleanup crew. The physical evidence of the confrontation was minimal: some spilled coffee, a few displaced service items, the zip-tied terrorists being wheeled away on gurneys. But Maya knew that the real changes were invisible, internal, permanent. Ms. Chen, Agent Morrison said, I need to ask you about your plans going forward. Maya looked around the cabin where she had rediscovered herself. I honestly don't know. This morning I was a food service worker saving money for my mother's medical bills. Tonight I'm not sure what I am. Agent Morrison smiled. I think I might have some suggestions. The FBI has several programs for individuals with your unique skill set. Counter-terrorism, airline security consulting, training programs for law enforcement. Your actions today have proven that your military training is not only intact, but enhanced by your civilian experience. Enhanced? You've learned to blend in, to be invisible, to operate without the support systems and authority that military personnel rely on. Those are incredibly valuable skills in counterterrorism work. Maya felt a stirring of possibility that she hadn't experienced in 8 years. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to use your abilities in service of something larger than yourself, again. As Maya walked through the Denver airport terminal later that evening, she found herself moving differently than she had that morning. Her posture was straighter, her gaze more direct, her presence more commanding. The reflection in the terminal windows showed a woman who looked like she knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Saw the news about your flight. Are you okay? Coming home soon? Maya stared at the message for a long moment, realizing that the woman who had left Los Angeles that morning no longer existed. The woman typing her response had been reborn at 40,000 feet, forged in the crucible of life and death decisions, and tempered by the recognition that some things were worth any risk. I'm more than okay, Mom, she typed back. I'm coming home. And I have so much to tell you. And Mom, we're going to be able to afford that treatment you need. I'm going to make sure of it. As she waited for her connecting flight back to Los Angeles, Maya reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken in a single day. This morning she had been Maya Chen, invisible food service worker, carrying the weight of perceived failure and lost dreams. Tonight she was Lieutenant Maya Chen, calcined phoenix, who had risen from 8 years of self-imposed exile to save 178 lives and rediscover her true calling. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, as if the past 8 years had been preparation rather than punishment, training rather than exile. Every difficult customer had taught her patience under pressure. Every double shift had built her endurance. Every moment of feeling overlooked and undervalued had prepared her for a situation where being underestimated was her greatest tactical advantage. But most importantly, Maya realized that her worth had never actually diminished. She had simply forgotten how to see it, allowed fear and self-doubt to eclipse the fundamental truth of who she was. The skills, the training, the instincts, they had all been there, waiting for the moment when something important enough would call them back to life. As her boarding call was announced, Maya stood with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone, including herself. Phoenix had risen from the ashes of doubt and self-recrimination, and she was ready to soar again. 6 months after Flight 447, Maya Chen stood in front of a classroom at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, facing 32 law enforcement officers from agencies across the country. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating a room filled with men and women who had come to learn from the woman who had become known in counter-terrorism circles as the Phoenix Incident. "The first thing you need to understand about threat assessment," Maya said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived the lessons she was teaching, "is that training never really leaves you. It can be buried under doubt, suppressed by circumstance or hidden by necessity, but it's always there, waiting for the moment when it's needed most." The students, FBI agents, air marshals, TS supervisors, and airline security specialists watched her with the focused attention reserved for instructors who had proven their expertise in real-world situations. Maya had been reluctant to accept the teaching position initially, still adjusting to the idea that her experiences were valuable enough to share with others. But Agent Morrison had been persuasive, and Maya had discovered that she possessed a gift for translating her instinctive tactical knowledge into practical instruction. "Ms. Chen," raised her hand Agent Patricia Williams, a 10-year veteran of airport security. "Can you walk us through your decision-making process when you first identified the suspects? What specific behaviors triggered your assessment?" Maya moved to the whiteboard, where she had drawn a schematic of Flight 447's cabin layout. "Excellent question. The initial indicators were too subtle for standard security protocols to catch, but clear enough for someone with military surveillance training. Let me show you what I observed." She began marking positions on the diagram, explaining how the 3 hijackers had positioned themselves to control key areas of the aircraft while maintaining the appearance of random seat selection. Her explanation was detailed, technical, and peppered with insights that could only come from someone who had experienced the situation firsthand. "The crucial factor," Maya continued, "was recognizing that their behavior was too coordinated to be coincidental, but too subtle to be detected by traditional security measures. They were counting on the fact that airline employees and passengers aren't trained to recognize tactical positioning." Agent Williams took notes rapidly. "How do we train our people to spot these kinds of patterns without creating an atmosphere of paranoia or racial profiling?" Maya paused, considering the question carefully. It was one she'd been asked repeatedly during her first months as a consultant, and it went to the heart of effective security policy. "The key is focusing on behavior rather than appearance. Nervousness, excessive surveillance, coordination between strangers, deviation from normal passenger patterns. These indicators are universal regardless of ethnicity, nationality, or religious affiliation." The class continued for another hour, with Maya fielding questions about everything from close quarters combat techniques to the psychological aftermath of high-stress confrontations. She had developed a reputation for brutal honesty about both the tactical and emotional aspects of counter-terrorism work, refusing to romanticize experiences that had been genuinely terrifying. After class, Maya walked across the academy grounds to her meeting with Director James Harrison, the head of the FBI's Aviation Security Division. The past 6 months had brought a whirlwind of changes: the teaching position, consulting work with airlines, media interviews, and the gradual reconstruction of her identity from food service worker to recognized expert in aviation security. Director Harrison was reviewing a stack of reports when Maya entered his office, but he set them aside immediately and gestured for her to take a seat. "Maya, I've got news that I think you'll find interesting. The intelligence we extracted from the Flight 447 terrorists has led to the disruption of a much larger network than we initially realized." Maya leaned forward, her interest piqued. "How much larger?" 17 planned attacks across 6 countries, all targeting commercial aviation. The 3 men you neutralized were part of a coordinated campaign designed to restore what their leadership called the fear of flying in Western populations. Your intervention didn't just save the passengers. On Flight 447, it prevented a global terrorism campaign. The weight of that revelation settled over Maya like a physical force. She had known that her actions had been significant, but the full scope of their impact was staggering. 17 attacks, all using similar tactics: small cells, ceramic weapons, coordination during meal service periods when crew attention was divided. The intelligence community believes that your successful counteraction forced them to abandon the entire operational framework. Director Harrison pulled out a folder marked with the highest classification levels. "Maya, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. The information we gathered from the Flight 447 cell has been shared with allied intelligence services worldwide. As a direct result of your actions, we've arrested 43 suspected terrorists, seized weapons caches in 12 countries, and prevented what could have been the largest coordinated terrorist attack since 9/11's. Maya stared at the folder, struggling to process the magnitude of what she was being told. "I just did what needed to be done in the moment. I never imagined." "That's exactly why you were so effective," Director Harrison interrupted. "You weren't operating from a playbook or following a predetermined strategy. You responded with pure tactical instinct honed by years of military training. The terrorists' planning didn't account for someone with your capabilities being in the wrong place at the right time." He opened the folder and showed Maya photographs, surveillance reports, and tactical assessments that detailed the scope of the disrupted network. The images were sobering: weapons, explosives, detailed attack plans that would have caused casualties in the thousands. "There's something else," Director Harrison continued. "The President has been briefed on your actions and their impact. She wants to personally commend you for your service." Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced whenever her military superiors had recognized her achievements. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not comfortable with public recognition. The passengers on Flight 447 deserve to get home safely." "That's recognition enough," Director Harrison smiled. "I told her you'd say that, which is exactly why she wants to meet you. Maya, you represent something that this country desperately needs: the reminder that heroism doesn't require a uniform or official authority. Sometimes it just requires someone who's willing to act when action is needed." The meeting concluded with Director Harrison offering Maya a permanent position as a senior consultant in aviation security, with responsibilities that would include policy development, training design, and threat assessment review. The salary was more than Maya had earned in her entire 8 years of food service work, enough to cover her mother's medical expenses and restore the financial security that had been eroded by years of struggle. That evening, Maya flew back to Los Angeles for the first time since the Flight 447 incident. As her plane descended toward LAX, she found herself looking down at the same airport where she had served burgers and wondered if customers wanted to make their meal a deal. The irony was profound. 6 months ago, she had been invisible in these same terminals, overlooked and undervalued. Now she was returning as a recognized expert whose insights were shaping national security policy. Her mother was waiting at the baggage claim, and Maya was struck by how much Chen had changed in 6 months. The experimental cancer treatment now, fully covered by Maya's new FBI consulting contract, had been remarkably successful. Eleanor's color was better, her energy level higher, and her smile brighter than Maya had seen in years. "There's my daughter," Eleanor said, embracing Maya with the fierce affection of someone who had almost lost the most important person in her life. "I still can't believe what you did. All these years, you were hiding such extraordinary abilities." Maya hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume and feeling the profound relief that came with knowing Eleanor would survive her battle with cancer. "Mom, I wasn't hiding anything. I had just forgotten who I was." They drove home through the familiar streets of Los Angeles, past the airport where Maya's transformation had begun, past the Murphy's fast food where she had worked for 8 years. Maya noticed that her old co-workers had posted a banner in the window. "Congratulations, Maya Chen, our hero." The gesture was touching, but it also highlighted how dramatically her life had changed. Over dinner, Eleanor peppered Maya with questions about her new career, her students at the FBI Academy, and her plans for the future. But eventually, the conversation turned to more personal matters. "Maya," Eleanor said carefully, "I need to ask you something. Are you happy? Really happy, not just professionally successful?" Maya considered the question thoughtfully. "Mom, for 8 years I defined myself by a moment of fear, by a few seconds when I felt human instead of superhuman. I convinced myself. That proved I was broken, that I didn't deserve the things I'd worked for. But what happened on Flight 447 taught me that being human doesn't make you weak, it makes you real." Eleanor reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "You were never broken, sweetheart. You were just learning." "Learning what?" "That real strength isn't about being fearless. It's about acting with courage even when you're afraid." Later that evening, Maya stood in her childhood bedroom, looking at the wall where her Air Force commendations and pilot's wings had hung for 8 years, gathering dust and serving as painful reminders of dreams deferred. She had taken them down after her resignation, unable to bear the daily confrontation with her perceived failure. Now she hung them back up, but with a difference. Beside her military decorations, she placed the letter of commendation from the FBI director, the thank you cards from Flight 447 passengers, and a photograph of her Quantico training class. The wall became a timeline of growth rather than a monument to lost evidence that sometimes the best version of yourself is forged in the crucible of your worst moments. Her phone buzzed with a text from Harold, the elderly veteran from Flight 447 who had become a regular correspondent. "Maya, Martha and I are in Paris. Saw the Eiffel Tower today and thought of you. Thank you again for giving us this gift." Attached was a photograph of Harold and Martha standing in front of the iconic tower, both of them glowing with the joy of people experiencing a dream they'd thought they might never live to see. Maya smiled, remembering her promise to Harold during those terrifying moments on the plane. "You and your wife are going to get to Paris." She had kept that promise, but more importantly, she had kept a promise to herself to remember who she was beneath the doubt and self-recrimination that had defined her civilian life. 3 weeks later, Maya received an unexpected visitor at her office in the FBI Academy. Jessica, the lead flight attendant from Flight 447, had driven down from Philadelphia to personally thank Maya for her actions during the hijacking. "Miss Chen," Jessica said, "I wanted you to know that what you did that day changed my life in ways I'm still discovering. I've enrolled in law enforcement training because I realized I want to be able to protect people the way you protected us." Maya was touched by the gesture, but also curious about Jessica's experience in the months following the incident. "How are you handling the psychological aftermath?" Situations like that can have lasting effects, Jessica smiled. I'm in counseling, which helps. But honestly, watching you take control of that situation gave me a different perspective on fear and courage. You showed me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they're willing to act. Their conversation continued for an hour, with Jessica asking detailed questions about Maya's transition from military service to civilian life and back to government work. Maya found herself sharing insights about resilience, identity, and the importance of not letting setbacks define your future. The thing about courage, Maya told Jessica, is that it's not a permanent state. You don't just possess it or lack it. It's a choice you make in specific moments, and you have to make that choice over and over again throughout your life. As Jessica prepared to leave, she handed Maya an envelope. This is from the crew of Flight 447. We wanted you to have something to remember us by. Inside was a photograph of the entire flight crew, signed with messages of gratitude and respect. But what moved Maya most was the inscription at the bottom, to Lieutenant Maya Chen, Calcine Phoenix, thank you for showing us what rising from the ashes looks like. That evening, Maya called Agent Morrison to discuss her next assignment. The FBI was developing a new threat assessment protocol based on Maya's insights from the Flight 447 incident, and they wanted her to lead the implementation across major airports nationwide. Maya, Agent Morrison said over the secure line, we're calling it the Phoenix Protocol. It focuses on training airline employees to recognize behavioral patterns that traditional security screening might miss. You'd be heading up a team of former military personnel and law enforcement officers, developing training programs for everyone from gate agents to baggage handlers. Maya felt a thrill of excitement that she hadn't experienced since her early days as a pilot. You're talking about turning airline employees into the first line of defense. Exactly. The Flight 447 terrorists succeeded in getting past every security checkpoint we had in place. They only failed because they encountered someone with your unique combination of training and intuition. We want to systematize that capability. The scope of the project was ambitious training programs for over 200,000 airline employees across 500 airports, new protocols for threat identification, and communication systems that could rapidly escalate concerns from ground-level workers to federal authorities. Maya would be responsible for designing the curriculum, overseeing the implementation, and ensuring that the program maintained effectiveness without creating unnecessary paranoia or discriminatory practices. There's one more thing, Agent Morrison continued. The program comes with a significant budget allocation for advanced training facilities. We want to build a simulation center where airline employees can practice threat response in realistic scenarios. Think of it as a civilian version of military combat training. Maya's mind immediately began envisioning the possibilities. She could create training scenarios based on actual terrorist tactics, develop decision trees for different types of threats, and provide airline employees with the confidence and skills they needed to act effectively in crisis situations. It would be the culmination of everything she had learned from her military training, her civilian experiences, and her rediscovered sense of purpose. Over the following months, Maya threw herself into the Phoenix Protocol development with the same intensity she had once brought to fighter pilot training. She traveled to airports across the country, interviewing employees, observing security procedures, and identifying vulnerabilities that traditional approaches had missed. She discovered that airline workers possessed an intimate knowledge of passenger behavior patterns that security professionals often overlooked, but they lacked the training to recognize when those patterns indicated potential threats. The breakthrough came during a training session at Chicago O'Hare, when a veteran gate agent named Roberto Martinez shared an observation that crystallized Maya's entire approach. Ms. Chen, Roberto said, I've been working gates for 15 years, and I can tell you within 5 minutes whether someone is nervous about flying, excited about their destination, or worried about something completely different. The problem is nobody ever taught me what to do with that information. That conversation led Maya to develop what became known as the Chen method, a systematic approach to behavioral observation that could be taught to any airline employee regardless of their background or education level. The method focused on identifying clusters of suspicious behaviors rather than individual actions, reducing the likelihood of false positives while maintaining high sensitivity to genuine threats. The first major test of the Phoenix Protocol came 8 months after Maya began implementation, when a baggage handler at Miami International Airport noticed 3 passengers whose behavior matched several indicators from Maya's training program. The passengers were traveling separately, but coordinating their movements through the terminal, checking their phones at synchronized intervals, and displaying the kind of heightened awareness that suggested tactical training. The baggage handler reported his observations through the new communication protocol Maya had established, and within minutes, federal air marshals were conducting discreet surveillance of the suspects. The investigation revealed that the 3 men were indeed planning an attack, using a methodology remarkably similar to the Flight 447 terrorists. The arrest was made before the suspects could board their flight, and the seizure of their materials revealed detailed plans for a coordinated assault on multiple aircraft. Once again, Maya's insights had prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack, but this time through the systematic application of her knowledge rather than individual heroism. The success of the Miami intervention validated everything Maya had worked to accomplish with the Phoenix Protocol. More importantly, it demonstrated that her experiences on Flight 447 could be translated into practical security measures that protected thousands of travelers without relying on extraordinary circumstances or individual heroism. Director Harrison called Maya personally to deliver the news about Miami. Maya, what you've accomplished with the Phoenix Protocol is unprecedented. We've created a security capability that didn't exist before Flight 447, and it's already proving its effectiveness. The President wants to discuss expanding the program internationally. Maya felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. She had taken the most terrifying experience of her life and transformed it into a tool for protecting others. The 8 years she had spent convinced of her own inadequacy had been redeemed by the systematic application of lessons learned through hardship and growth. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Chen had been following her daughter's career transformation with quiet pride, but it wasn't until she attended one of Maya's training presentations that she fully understood the scope of what Maya had accomplished. "Sweetheart," Eleanor said after watching Maya lead a session for airport security supervisors, "I want you to know that I've never been more proud of you than I am right now. Not because of what you did on that plane, but because of what you've done since then. You've taken something terrible and turned it into something that protects people. That's not just heroism, that's wisdom." Maya hugged her mother, feeling the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing you've found your true calling. "Mom, for 8 years I thought I was being punished for my failures. Now I realize I was being prepared for something I couldn't have imagined." The Phoenix Protocol continued to expand, with international airports requesting training programs and foreign governments seeking consultation on aviation security. Maya found herself traveling the world, sharing her insights with security professionals from dozens of countries, always emphasizing that effective threat detection required both technical knowledge and human intuition. But she never forgot the lesson that had started it all, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is remember who you are beneath the doubt and fear that life inevitably brings. She had spent 8 years hiding from her true capabilities, convinced that one moment of human vulnerability had disqualified her from greatness. The truth, she learned, was exactly the opposite. Her vulnerability had made her stronger, more empathetic, and ultimately more effective at protecting others. The 8 years in food service hadn't been a punishment. They had been training for a mission she couldn't have imagined when she first hung up her pilot's wings. As Maya prepared for her next international assignment, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the cockpit of an F-16 to a fast food counter, to the highest levels of national security policy. Every step had been necessary, every hardship had been preparation, and every moment of doubt had been overcome by the simple decision to act with courage when courage was needed most. Phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes, but she had brought others with her, creating systems and capabilities that would protect travelers for generations to come. And that, Maya realized, was a legacy worth every moment of the journey that had brought her home to herself. Maya Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office on the 23rd floor of the Federal Building in Washington, D.C., watching aircraft trace familiar patterns across the Potomac River. As the newly appointed Deputy Director of the Transportation Security Administration's Behavioral Detection Division, she commanded a view that encompassed both Reagan National Airport and the Pentagon symbols of American aviation and the security apparatus that protected it. The Phoenix Protocol had evolved far beyond her original vision. What had begun as a training program for airline employees had become a comprehensive approach to transportation security that was being implemented in airports, train stations, and bus terminals across 43 countries. Maya's methodology had been adapted, refined, and expanded by security professionals worldwide, but the core principle remained unchanged. Ordinary people, properly trained, could become an extraordinary line of defense against those who sought to harm innocent travelers. Ms. Chen, her assistant's voice came through the intercom. The delegation from Japan Airlines has arrived for their briefing on the advanced Phoenix implementation. Maya smiled, straightening her navy blue suit jacket, a far cry from the polyester uniform she had worn for 8 years. Send them to conference room. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As she gathered her materials for the meeting, Maya's eyes fell on the framed photograph that held the place of honor on her desk. It showed the entire crew and passenger manifest of Flight 447, taken at their 2-year reunion in Paris. Harold and Martha stood in the center, both healthy and glowing with the joy of people who had been given unexpected time together. Jessica was there too, now a federal air marshal whose career had been inspired by that day at 40,000 feet. But the image that meant the most to Maya was a smaller photo tucked into the corner of the frame. Eleanor Chen at her cancer treatment graduation ceremony, ringing the bell that signified the end of her chemotherapy. Maya's mother had been cancer-free for 18 months, her remission funded by the career transformation that had grown from those terrifying minutes on Flight 447. The Japanese delegation was eager to implement the Phoenix Protocol across their domestic airline network, but they had specific concerns about cultural adaptation and training methodologies. Maya had conducted similar briefings for dozens of international partners, and she had learned that effective security required understanding not just tactical principles, but cultural contexts. The foundation of the Phoenix Protocol, Maya explained to the assembled airline executives and security officials, is not about creating suspicion or fear. It's about empowering your employees to trust their instincts and act on observations that might otherwise be dismissed as unimportant. The head of Japan Airlines Security Division, Mr. Tanaka, raised his hand. Ms. Chen, our employees are trained to be respectful and non-confrontational. How do we balance cultural values with security requirements? Maya had faced this question in various forms around the world, and her answer had evolved through experience. Mr. Tanaka, the most effective security often appears invisible to those being protected. Your employees don't need to become aggressive or confrontational. They need to become observant and connected to a communication system that can escalate their concerns appropriately. She clicked to a slide showing statistics from the protocol's implementation across different cultural contexts. In fact, our data suggests that employees from cultures that emphasize social harmony and attention to group dynamics often excel at threat detection because they're naturally attuned to behavior that disrupts normal social patterns. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from training methodologies to communication protocols to legal frameworks for employee actions. Maya had become fluent in the complex intersection of security policy, international law, and practical implementation that characterized modern counter-terrorism efforts. After the delegation departed, Maya returned to her office to find Agent Morrison waiting with a thick folder marked with the highest security classifications. "Maya," Morrison said, "I have news that I think you'll find both gratifying and concerning. We've just concluded a comprehensive analysis of terrorist threats to aviation over the past 3 years. Maya settled into her chair, recognizing the expression that meant Morrison was about to deliver significant intelligence. "What did you find?" Morrison opened the folder and spread out charts, graphs, and photographs. "Since the implementation of the Phoenix Protocol, we've documented 47 attempted terrorist attacks against aviation targets worldwide. Of those 47 attempts, 31 were detected and disrupted by employees trained in your methodology." The statistics were staggering, but Maya found herself focusing on the 16 attempts that hadn't been stopped by the protocol. "What about the other 16? 12 were detected by traditional security measures, metal detectors, X-ray machines, explosive detection systems. 3 were stopped by air marshals after attacks had begun. And 2... double quotes." Morrison paused, her expression growing grave. 2 succeeded in causing casualties before they were contained." Maya felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with her position. Every success was gratifying, but every failure was a reminder that real people paid the price for gaps in security systems. "What can we learn from the failures?" Morrison pulled out a separate folder. "That's why I'm here. The analysis suggests that the Phoenix Protocol is most effective against traditional terrorist tactics, the kinds of coordinated attacks you encountered on Flight 447. But we're seeing evolution in enemy methodology. They're adapting to our defensive measures." Maya studied the intelligence reports, her mind automatically analyzing patterns and identifying potential countermeasures. The terrorist organizations had indeed adapted, developing new tactics specifically designed to circumvent behavioral detection. Some used individuals with no previous connection to extremist movements, making them virtually invisible to standard screening. Others employed techniques borrowed from espionage tradecraft, training operatives to display normal behavioral patterns, even under stress. "What are you recommending?" Maya asked. Morrison smiled grimly. "Evolution. We need to enhance the Phoenix Protocol with capabilities we haven't developed yet. Advanced psychological profiling, technology integration, and most importantly, a new level of training that goes beyond behavior recognition to include threat response." The proposal Morrison outlined was ambitious, a next-generation security program that would transform airline employees from passive observers into active participants in aviation security. The technical requirements were substantial, the training would be complex, and the legal implications were significant. But Maya could see the potential for a security capability that would be decades ahead of anything currently deployed. "How much authority are we talking about?" Maya asked. "Limited detention capabilities, direct communication with federal response teams, and in extreme circumstances, authorization to take physical action to prevent terrorist attacks." Maya leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. The program Morrison was describing would essentially create a civilian security force embedded within the Aviation industry, thousands of trained individuals who could serve as both early warning system and first line of defense against terrorist attacks. Morrison, Maya said slowly, you're talking about turning flight attendants and gate agents into federal law enforcement officers. I'm talking about giving them the tools and authority to do what you did on Flight 447, but in a systematic, legally authorized framework. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Maya and Morrison developing the conceptual framework for what would eventually become known as the Phoenix Advanced Protocol. The technical challenges were significant, but Maya had learned that the most effective security innovations often emerged from the intersection of practical experience and theoretical capability. 5 years later, the graduation ceremony for the first class of Phoenix Advanced Protocol specialists took place at a purpose-built training facility outside of Quantico, Virginia. Maya watched from the reviewing stand as 127 airline employees, flight attendants, gate agents, baggage handlers, and maintenance supervisors received their certification as federal aviation security specialists. The ceremony was attended by officials from the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the TSA, and aviation industry representatives from around the world. But Maya's attention was focused on the graduates themselves, men and women who had committed to a year of intensive training that covered everything from advanced threat recognition to close quarters combat to federal law enforcement procedures. Among the graduates was Jessica, now serving as a lead instructor in the Phoenix program. Standing beside her was Roberto Martinez, the Chicago gate agent whose observations had led to Maya's breakthrough in behavioral analysis methodology. Both had been transformed by their involvement in the program, but they represented thousands of airline employees worldwide who had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed. The keynote speaker was Director Harrison, now head of the newly created Office of Transportation Security Innovation. Today, he told the assembled crowd, we celebrate not just the graduation of these remarkable individuals, but the evolution of aviation security into something that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. He gestured toward Maya, who had been asked to present the graduation certificates. The Phoenix Protocol began with one person's decision to act with courage in an impossible situation. Today, that decision has become a systematic capability that protects millions of travelers around the world. Maya stepped to the podium, looking out at the faces of people who had chosen to dedicate their careers to protecting others. When I neutralized those 3 terrorists on Flight 447, she began, I thought I was acting alone. I thought I was the only person who could respond to that threat. She paused, scanning the audience of graduates, instructors, and officials. What I've learned in the years since is that courage is not a rare commodity. Every person in this audience has the capacity for extraordinary action when circumstances demand it. The difference is training, preparation, and the confidence that comes from knowing you have the skills and authority to act effectively. The ceremony concluded with each graduate receiving their federal credentials and assignment to their respective airports. Maya personally congratulated each specialist, remembering her own transformation from food service worker to counter-terrorism expert. Many of the graduates shared similar stories, ordinary people who had discovered extraordinary capabilities through the Phoenix program. After the ceremony, Maya drove to Arlington National Cemetery for a personal ritual she had maintained for 5 years. Section 60 contained the graves of service members killed in recent conflicts, and Maya had adopted the practice of visiting whenever she was in Washington for significant Phoenix program milestones. She knelt beside the grave of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a pilot who had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years after Maya's resignation from the Air Force. Sarah had been Maya's mentor during Top Gun training, and Maya had always wondered if she might have made different choices about her military career if Sarah had been available for guidance during her crisis of confidence. Sarah, Maya said quietly, placing a small American flag beside the headstone. "I wanted to tell you about the graduation today. 127 people committed to protecting others, the same way you taught me to protect the things that matter." The cemetery was quiet, except for the distant sound of aircraft approaching Reagan National Airport. Maya found the irony poetic. She was honoring the memory of a fellow pilot while listening to the sounds of civilian aviation that she now helped protect. "I think you would have understood what I've learned," Maya continued, "that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never thought of themselves as warriors. That courage comes in many forms, and the most powerful form is often the decision to serve others regardless of personal cost." As she prepared to leave, Maya's phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Chen was now 78, healthy, and living in a comfortable retirement home in Santa Monica. The message was typically concise. "Saw the graduation on the news. Proud of you, sweetheart." Maya smiled, typing back, "Thanks, Mom. Coming to visit next week. Love you." The drive back to Washington took her past Reagan National Airport, where she could see aircraft taking off and landing in the familiar patterns she had studied for decades. Some of those planes carried passengers who would never know how many people were working to ensure their safety. Flight attendants trained in threat recognition, gate agents with federal law enforcement authority, maintenance crews educated in security protocols, and air marshals equipped with intelligence capabilities that hadn't existed before flight. 447. 10 years later, Maya's retirement ceremony took place at the same Pentagon auditorium where she had once received her Top Gun wings as a young Air Force lieutenant. The symbolism was intentional. Her career had come full circle, from military service through civilian exile to federal leadership, and now to honored retirement. The Secretary of Homeland Security delivered the keynote address, detailing the statistical impact of the Phoenix Protocol over its decade of implementation. The numbers were impressive: 247 terrorist attacks prevented, over 50,000 airline employees trained, and security capabilities deployed in 89 countries worldwide. But Maya knew that the real measure of success wasn't in statistics, it was in the fact that millions of people had traveled safely because ordinary workers had been empowered to do extraordinary things. Chen, the secretary said, represents the finest tradition of American public service. She took a personal experience of terror and trauma and transformed it into a systematic capability that has protected countless innocent lives. The ceremony included video messages from international partners, former colleagues, and Phoenix Protocol graduates who had gone on to leadership positions in aviation security. But the message that moved Maya most came from an unexpected source: Captain Rodriguez, the pilot of Flight 447, who had retired from commercial aviation but maintained contact with Maya over the years. "Maya," he said in his recorded message, "what you did that day saved my life and the lives of everyone on my aircraft. But what you've done since then has saved thousands of lives I'll never meet. That's the difference between heroism and legacy." After the formal ceremony, Maya found herself in the Pentagon courtyard, surrounded by colleagues, friends, and family members who had gathered to celebrate her retirement. Chen, now 85 but still sharp and energetic, held court near the refreshment table, regaling anyone who would listen with stories of her daughter's childhood determination and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Harold and Martha were there too, both in their 90s but still traveling together. They had become symbols of the Phoenix Protocol's human impact, the elderly couple whose anniversary trip to Paris had been saved by Maya's intervention, and who had spent the subsequent decade advocating for aviation security improvements. "Maya," Harold said, approaching with the careful steps of someone whose body was no longer reliable, but whose mind remained sharp, "Martha and I wanted to give you something before we head home." He handed her a small wrapped package that contained a vintage compass, the kind used by aviators before GPS systems made such instruments obsolete. The inscription read, "To Lieutenant Maya Chen, Calcine Phoenix, thank you for always knowing the right direction. Harold and Martha, Flight 447. Maya." Felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by the gesture and its symbolism. "Harold, this is beautiful. But you've already given me more than enough. You trusted me during the most important moment of my life." Martha squeezed Maya's hand with surprising strength. "Dear, you gave us 10 extra years together. Every morning, when I wake up next to this stubborn old man, I remember that it's because you were brave enough to act when action was needed." As the reception continued, Maya found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 53 years old, having served her country as a fighter pilot, struggled through 8 years of exile and self-doubt, and then rebuilt her life into something more impactful than she had ever imagined possible. The Phoenix Protocol would continue without her, led by a new generation of security professionals who had been trained in methodologies she had developed. The advanced protocol was being expanded to cover maritime and ground transportation, creating a comprehensive security capability that extended far beyond aviation. And international partners were developing their own versions of the Phoenix methodology, adapted to their specific cultural and operational contexts. But Maya's thoughts kept returning to that moment on Flight 447 when she had made the decision to act despite her fears and self-doubt. Everything that followed the career transformation, the life-saving protocols, the thousands of people protected had grown from that single choice to remember who she was beneath the fear. Jessica approached as the reception was winding down, now serving as Director of Phoenix Protocol International Operations. "Maya, I have a question I've wanted to ask you for 10 years. Maya smiled, recognizing the expression of someone preparing to ask something significant. "What's that?" "That day on Flight 447, when you made the decision to act, were you afraid?" Maya considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would become part of the Phoenix Protocol legacy. "Jessica, I was terrified, absolutely, completely terrified. But I realized that being afraid and being capable aren't mutually exclusive. Fear doesn't disqualify you from courage. It's the raw material that courage is made from." "Is that what you want people to remember about the Phoenix Protocol?" Maya looked around the courtyard at the faces of people whose lives had been shaped by the program she had created. "I want them to remember that extraordinary capabilities exist in ordinary people. That the difference between someone who acts and someone who doesn't isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that protecting others is worth overcoming your fear." As the sun set over Washington, Maya prepared to leave the Pentagon for the final time as a federal employee. Her retirement plans included consulting work, writing a book about the development of modern aviation security, and spending time with her mother while Eleanor's health remained strong. But most importantly, Maya was looking forward to the freedom to simply be herself, not the hero of Flight 447, not the creator of the Phoenix Protocol, not a symbol of transformation and redemption, but simply Maya Chen, a woman who had learned that the most important journey is the one that brings you home to who you were always meant to be. 15 years. Later, the documentary crew had spent 3 days at Maya's home in Santa Barbara, interviewing her for a film about the long-term impact of the Phoenix Protocol. At 68, Maya had silver hair and laugh lines, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her such an effective pilot and security expert. "Miss Chen," the director asked during their final interview session, "what do you want people to understand about that day on Flight 447? Maya considered the question, aware that this interview would likely be her final public statement about the incident that had defined the second half of her life. "I want them to understand that heroes aren't people who are fearless. Heroes are people who act despite their fear because something important is at stake." The interviewer pressed further. But surely you must have known that your military training made you uniquely qualified to handle that situation? Maya shook her head. That's exactly the wrong lesson to take from what happened. Yes, I had training that was relevant. But the most important thing I had was the decision to act. Every person watching this documentary has capabilities they don't recognize, skills they don't appreciate, and courage they haven't discovered yet. She gestured toward the window where aircraft could be seen in the distance following their approach paths to Lax. Right now on one of those planes, there might be someone facing a moment that will define their life and the lives of everyone around them. They might be a teacher, a nurse, a mechanic, a student, someone who has never thought of themselves as capable of extraordinary action. And your message to that person would be? Maya smiled with the confidence of someone who had lived through transformation and emerged stronger. Remember who you are beneath the doubt and fear. Trust your training, whatever form it has taken. And understand that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be paralyzed by the magnitude of what's at stake. The documentary, titled Phoenix Rising, The Maya Chen Story, premiered at film festivals worldwide and was eventually acquired by streaming services that made it available to global audiences. The film sparked renewed interest in the Phoenix Protocol and led to its implementation in several countries that had previously resisted adopting American-developed security methodologies. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 6 months after the documentary's release, Maya received a letter from a young woman named Sofia Rodriguez, a hotel security guard in Miami who had prevented a terrorist attack by recognizing behavioral patterns she had learned from watching Maya's interview. Ms. Chen, the letter read, I want you to know that your story gave me the courage to trust my instincts when I saw something that didn't seem right. Because of what you taught me about paying attention to my observations, I was able to alert authorities before 3 men could carry out an attack on my hotel. The FBI told me that my actions potentially saved hundreds of lives. Maya kept that letter on her desk beside the photograph from the Flight 447 reunion and the compass Harold had given her at her retirement ceremony. It represented the continuation of a legacy that had grown far beyond her individual actions. Network of ordinary people empowered to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Eleanor Chen passed away peacefully at age 91, surrounded by family and friends who had been enriched by her wisdom and strength. At the memorial service, Maya spoke about her mother's influence on her life and career. My mother taught me that strength isn't about being invincible, Maya said to the gathered mourners. It's about getting up every day and doing what needs to be done, even when it's difficult, even when you're afraid, even when you don't know if you have the strength to continue. She paused, looking out at faces that included colleagues from every phase of her life: military service, food service, federal law enforcement, and retirement. She also taught me that the most important legacy isn't what you accomplish for yourself, but what you make possible for others. 20 years later, the invitation arrived on cream-colored paper with elegant letterhead. The International Aviation Security Council cordially invites you to the dedication of the Maya Chen Center for Transportation Security Innovation. The ceremony would take place at Reagan National Airport in a new facility designed to serve as the global headquarters for Phoenix Protocol Training and Development. Maya, now 73 and using a walking cane due to arthritis in her knees, traveled to Washington for what she expected would be her final public appearance related to the Phoenix Protocol. The years had been kind to her. She remained mentally sharp, physically active, and emotionally fulfilled by a life that had exceeded her wildest dreams. The dedication ceremony drew attendees from around the world: aviation security professionals, government officials, airline executives, and Phoenix Protocol graduates who had come to honor the woman whose courage had sparked a revolution in transportation security. The keynote speaker was President Sarah Martinez, the first Latina president of the United States who had served As a Transportation Security Administration administrator during the early years of the Phoenix Protocol implementation, Maya Chen, President Martinez said to the assembled crowd, represents the finest American tradition of turning adversity into opportunity, fear into courage, and individual achievement into collective benefit. The President detailed the statistical impact of the Phoenix Protocol over its 20-year history: 1,247 terrorist attacks prevented, 187,000 transportation workers trained, and security capabilities that had been adopted by 127 countries worldwide. But she also spoke about the less quantifiable impacts: the confidence that travelers felt knowing they were protected, the pride that airline employees took in their expanded roles, and the demonstration that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. Maya was invited to speak at the conclusion of the ceremony, and she approached the podium with the measured steps of someone who had learned to move carefully but purposefully. The audience rose in sustained applause that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Recognition, not just of her specific achievements, but of the inspiration she had provided to generations of people who had faced their own moments of truth. 20 years ago, Maya began, her voice still strong despite her age. I was a food service worker who had spent 8 years convinced that I was broken, that a moment of fear had disqualified me from greatness. I served hamburgers to travelers who barely noticed I existed, and I believed that invisibility was what I deserved. She paused, scanning the audience of faces that included some of the most accomplished security professionals in the world. What I learned on Flight 447 wasn't that I was special or uniquely qualified to handle that situation. What I learned was that every person carries within themselves capabilities they haven't discovered, courage they haven't tested, and potential they haven't explored. Maya's final public address lasted 23 minutes and covered the development of the Phoenix Protocol, the philosophy behind effective security measures, and the importance of empowering ordinary people to take extraordinary actions. But the moment that resonated most with attendees came near the end, when she shared her perspective on legacy. I hope that when people remember the Phoenix Protocol, they don't remember me as someone exceptional who did something impossible. I hope they remember that courage is a choice available to everyone, that training matters less than determination, and that the most important question you can ask yourself in a crisis is not, am I qualified to handle this, but am I willing to try? The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze statue in the center's main lobby, a life-sized figure of Maya in her flight attendant uniform from Flight 447, positioned as if moving down an aircraft aisle. The inscription read, "Lieutenant Maya Chen, Calcine Phoenix. She taught us that heroes are ordinary people who choose to act when action is needed." That evening, Maya returned to her hotel room and found a message waiting from someone she hadn't heard from in nearly 2 decades. Harold and Martha's grandson, now a commercial pilot with Delta Airlines, had written to tell her that he thought of her every time he walked through the security checkpoint at the beginning of his workday. "Miss Chen," the message read, "my grandparents told me stories about you my entire life. They said you taught them that age doesn't disqualify you from courage, and that lesson has guided me through my own career. I wanted you to know that every flight I command carries passengers who are safer because of what you created. That's a legacy that extends far beyond anything you could have imagined." Maya set the message aside and walked to her hotel window, looking out at the lights of aircraft taking off and landing at Reagan National Airport. Each set of lights represented hundreds of people traveling safely because of security systems that had grown from her decision to act with courage during the worst moment of her life. But more importantly, those lights represented the continuation of something larger than individual achievement. They represented a network of ordinary people who had been empowered to do extraordinary things, a systematic capability that would protect travelers long after Maya was gone, and a demonstration that courage was not a rare gift but a common capacity that could be developed and deployed when circumstances demanded it. As she prepared for bed, Maya reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the cockpit of a fighter jet to a fast food counter to the highest levels of national security policy. Every step had been necessary, every hardship had been preparation, and every moment of doubt had been overcome by the simple recognition that some things were worth any risk. Phoenix had risen from the ashes of fear and self-doubt, and in rising, she had lifted thousands of others with her. And that, Maya knew, was the only legacy that truly mattered.